It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. What's up? What's happening? Craig Hoffman, Logan Paulsen, and Logan. This is the first official podcast of the Josh Harris era. We made it.
Right.
We did it.
We did it. Yeah, it's pretty exciting, man. You know, like I'm not a guy who gets overly excited, you know what I mean, about stuff. I'm pretty low key. But
You love a good third down call more than you do an ownership change.
That's
at least
right.
conceptually, until we got to the ownership change.
Until we got to the ownership change. And I think, we'll talk about this more, but like being at the event, and I wish I could have gone to the event at the bullpen. It sounded like it was awesome. But being at the event at the stadium on Friday was like kind of eye-opening for me. So we'll talk about that more, I guess, in a minute.
Yeah. Also, there's some offensive innovation happening in the league that has caught Logan's eye. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the podcast. But we are going to start with the ownership change. Obviously, the biggest story ahead of training camp, and we will do our full training camp preview on the second pod this week. That'll come out on Thursday. So, I was blown away, if I'm being honest, with everything that's happened over that 48-hour stretch from Harris's initial comments to like the unanimous vote was not surprising. I do think it's hilarious. The NBA also just had a vote on an ownership change in Charlotte. Michael Jordan sold the team to some other rich guys, and James Dolan, the owner of the Knicks, voted against it. I don't know why, but it's just like James Dolan is the Dan Snyder of the NBA, and he's a gigantic pain in the ass at all times. So of course he did, even if he might have had some reason to do it. You just assume that he's being terrible. Anyway, this is not a kill James Dolan podcast. There are entire podcasts dedicated to that. But to see Harris's comments, some kind of tacit acknowledgments of some bad things that Snyder did, not just like misconduct bad, but like did a bad job of running the team in a particular way, and like kind of facing some of that stuff head on through the way he answered questions on Friday. And again, same kind of thing, to just the energy and the way he interacted with the crowd. And to me, Logan, the two things that stood out are, I think Snyder was consistently inhumane and consistently incompetent. And when I say inhumane, like out of touch, there was no human touch to anything he did. And I think Harris, whether on purpose or just by nature, hit those two chords tremendously well. There was a human touch to all of it. And there was a competency that in his words and in his message and in clearly his vision that came across just in his opening comments. Nevertheless, what we'll ultimately see when they become action.
Yeah, I think like kind of you're probably saying this, but like the professionalism element of it, right? Like it just was like you could tell he's done it before. He's owned teams. He knows the process. Like even at the press conference, they've got the right people there. Like Joe Gibbs is there. They've got the some very recognizable older faces. They had a whole alumni section. They invited, I want to say it was like probably 50 or 100 people. They had lunch beforehand with the ownership group, and they got to meet them kind of one-on-one. I just thought that was a really good idea, and like good ideas and like making sure you're connected to the past of the team and kind of, especially in this environment of like the name change and all this stuff, like just acknowledging that those guys are a part of this culture and a part of this organization. I thought was great. Like the way he communicated kind of his vision, it's about winning. I think the other thing that was interesting too was that like not an insignificant number of the ownership group were former athletes at some level, right? Like he's a former wrestler, Josh Harris, obviously Magic Johnson. The other gentleman, I'm forgetting his name at the moment.
Mitchell Rales or Mark
Mitchell Rales. Yeah, Mitchell Rales is a former football player. Like he was a very good, like high school kind of almost college player, but has a lot of respect and admiration for the sport. And I just thought, man, that's something that is nice, and again, like I'm not saying that's like super critical, but it was just nice to hear them kind of acknowledge the struggles of the players, it's difficult, the lack of support they've had over the last couple of years. And, it's just words really at this point, but like in terms of like checking a box, like the press conference was great. And then you mentioned like, I was hosting that event or I was emceeing, not hosting, I was emceeing the event on Friday, and to see him come out like kind of like a rock star, you know what I'm saying? And high-fiving, doing autographs, it felt very real. It felt very like, I don't think I've ever seen Dan do anything like that in my whole time here, and so like it just felt very different. And just to hear the support of the crowd for him and the excitement of the environment was something that I guess I didn't really expect. So it was a pretty cool moment for sure.
Yeah, being an extrovert versus an introvert, and Dan was an extreme introvert.
Right.
Bad thing if you own a football team, typically. But that inherently doesn't mean that you're
Yeah.
competent or anything like that. You know, we did have a little bit of fun on the show on Friday on the radio show after seeing some of the footage of Harris out there slapping fives and, you know, let's go, like all that stuff.
Yeah.
And we were saying, like, you know, if you tossed a football at Josh Harris, he'd catch it. If you toss one at Dan Snyder, he'd like fumble it and possibly hit himself in the face with it. But like, as funny as it is in terms of contrasting imagery, like at the end of the day, I would have to acknowledge that doesn't actually mean you can
Right.
run a business. There's plenty of competent, very very good CEOs who would also fumble the football and wind up hitting themselves in the face with it. But there is what I do think matters is like that in touch nature where he talked about, I'm sweating this. Like he's excited. He owns an NFL team, and that is one of 32 to be a managing partner, or one of 31 because the Packers have their conglomerate
Yeah.
situation. But one of 31 that you are in the entire world. That's a very very exclusive membership, and it means something. But what it means is you have the job and now you have to do it. And the job is way more than signing checks.
Yeah.
And I think Harris, because of his prior experience, understands that. And to me, the quote of the day is, and he said this both days. So the quotes of the days is, being a fan is not enough. You know, Dan was notoriously a fan. And the quote from him when he bought the team, when they were like, well, how are you going to run it? Like, you know, do you care about this? Whatever. It's like, I'm a fan, and that's all there is to be said.
Right.
Like, he wanted the team to win, but that doesn't actually mean you know how to make it happen. For Josh to say, hey, I'm a fan, but being a fan is not enough, acknowledges to me the height of the climb, that he's aware of it, how tough it's going to be, that there's a lot of work to be done, and that simply wanting it to happen and rooting isn't the job. It's your job to go and find the right people to make the things happen, to bring that desire for a result to reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like he's done it before. Like like he's sweating it because he knows it. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like when you got a hard workout coming up, like you're sweating it because you know how hard it is. You know what I'm saying? Like you've been on that journey before. And that's something that I got a lot of respect for. And like when you look at the ownership group, like Magic, his success in the sports industry, and you know, he's a smaller percentage owner or whatever, but like I think even having that is a huge deal. Like having that guy who's with that pedigree, the winning pedigree, and he said it's important for me to win. And I think Josh Harris has shown that he's got, winning is important to him as well. Like there's something to having guys who've done it before and have a certain level of experience that I think is really, really important. And, I agree. I think they're sweating it because they know how hard it is. They know it's a big lift, but at least they've been in this water before. They've been in this deep water and they know how to swim in it, as opposed to somebody who's like just jumping in the first time. They don't understand that there's waves and issues and sharks and stuff happening. Like they're ready to go. So.
Yeah, there's something to that Josh said that I'm curious to see how he follows through on. And again, this is not me doubting. It's just like who's in the room ultimately.
Just early, yeah.
Yeah, we just don't know, but he's saying the right things, right? How does it turn into practice? But he talked about having diversity in the ownership group and diversity in the organization. You know, we want to build a diverse organization. And obviously that is a phrase that like gets under a lot of people's skins, and it's very charged politically. But like, let me explain to people who might not fully understand why that's important, right? Having multiple ideas at the table and then an ability to discuss them and parse out whose idea is best, or which parts of whose idea are best, and ultimately come up with the best game plan is super important. And so having Magic Johnson, not just as a black man who understands a part of the community that perhaps Josh Harris doesn't, but having Josh Harris and understanding where he comes from in the Bethesda area, and like when he's talking to his buddies, that part of the fan base. Magic's got all kinds of business ventures in PG County, and you have these different people from all around the region. That's good because your fan base is wide and has a lot of diversity to it. So do you bring those different, touch points to the table? Do you bring people's different life experiences? Magic's, time in the NBA and other business ventures, Rail's work in different, parts of it, Mark Ein's work, Harris's work. But then also I think the thing that is good, that is kind of the unstated part of this, is they're actually not coming in at ground zero. And I'll give Jason Wright credit, which is probably going to get me in more trouble than pointing out, hey, Josh talked about diversity, because everyone wants to murder Jason for any number of reasons. And I'm not saying Jason's done a perfect job. Jason wouldn't tell you Jason's done a perfect job. But Jason has built an incredibly diverse group in the business side of that office. And there's also great diversity for whatever it's worth on the football side of it, including the only Hispanic coach in the league. But with Jason's folks in particular, the ones that are going to run the business side and kind of, be making a lot of decisions about where the franchise goes for everything but the players on the field, having a group in place that is super highly accomplished, comes from a wide variety of backgrounds, to mix with Josh and his people that are coming in, I think is a tremendous formula and should allow them to give or hit the ground running a lot sooner than if they had to go out and hire all these people. Because if you just had a bunch of people that worked for Dan Snyder and were the kind of people that worked for Dan Snyder for most of the 20 plus years of the franchise, not the best to say the least, I think you'd be years away from reaping some rewards that I think this team can start reaping rather immediately on the business side of things. And you see the results already, because like I think I saw over the weekend, like their suite sales and their ticket sales are higher now than they have been in years, like at least since 2017, if not higher. And that's just on the heels of the announcement 3 days ago as we sit here recording this.
Yeah, and I think it just shows you how frustrated people were and how excited people are for change, And I think you're right. I think the diversity of the ownership group is extremely important. I think it's important regardless, right? It's important on a coaching staff. It's important in any kind of business venture. You've got your own business thing you're working on right now, Craig. Like, it's important to have different ideas in there. Just people saying, "Hey, man, like that's not been my experience." Then you kind of say, "Well, that's good to know." And so I think that's great. I think that it's good that it's a group. It's not one guy. He's got some people to answer to, and I think that's awesome. And I think I'm so happy for the fan base right now. And again, we don't know anything. It's like day 3 of this, and it could be terrible. But I have a feeling that it just something different is going to be beneficial for this group, for this organization, for this area, for this team, and to see the fans at the event. It reminded me a little bit of like 2012. Like when things are starting to like some positive news, you know what I'm saying? It's like some positive energy and atmosphere. And that's great, and that's great. And hopefully the team this year can win some football games and continue that and kind of ride this wave a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy. I think it's going to be a cool thing for the area. And it feels like they've got the right types of guys. You know what I mean? Guys that have done it, guys that are experienced, guys that are successful in business. I know that's not the only thing, but I'm optimistic about it. So we'll see.
Yeah. And guys that are open to learning about this business. Everyone's a little different. The NBA is a little different than Major League Baseball, different than the NHL, different than, running a soccer team, which Harris also has an ownership stake of in Crystal Palace over in England. Like because of salary cap reasons, because of the nature of each sport. In the NBA, the only thing that matters is getting one of those dudes, one of the 6-7 best players on the planet. Otherwise, you're basically impossible to win. In the NFL, I think we're potentially heading for a reckoning in a couple of years where, you have a quarterback, but you paid him so much money that the rest of your roster can't keep up. Like there's kind of that swing starting, and can you be ahead of that on the innovation front? So there's just different business models. But I think to your point, the fan base side of it, the energy is incredible. Yeah. And I've been I was so excited to see the turnout that we had on Thursday, because in some ways that was like the first test, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, are people going to reserve their judgment? Are they going to go for this? And we had thousands of people coming through the bullpen to help us celebrate. The energy in there was crazy. People just overjoyed. And it looked like that was not even we put on a crazy good event. My bosses should be very proud of what they did. And I'm pretty sure that they are. But what happened on Friday, man, I wasn't able to go out there because it was like a 1 o'clock thing when the show starts at 4 and DC traffic. Good luck. But man, that looked incredible on Friday.
It was great, and the turnout was great. I think it was just like, I'd say there was probably, I don't know, it felt like, kind of in the mid hundreds of people there, maybe 1,000, I don't know, something like that. Nothing crazy, but the people that were there were like so fired up, like there was such a good energy there. And, made emceeing the event super easy, because you just would say anything and people were like, "Oh my gosh, this is the best day ever," and you could just kind of feel all that kind of that pent up, like malcontent kind of just wearing off. The thing I'd like to ask you, Craig, is just like, what are some differences from like an ownership standpoint, like that fans should keep an eye out for? Because like a lot about basketball, about roster construction. Like this feels like a totally different ball of wax because you have kind of like a X's and O's, you have a personnel, you have all these different things you have to handle, which are very different from like soccer, hockey, and basketball, quite frankly. So like,
Yeah. I mean, I think if I'm Harris looking at what his track record is, he likes to be on the cutting edge and he's not afraid to push things to a bit of an extreme. I mean, that was the whole deal with the process in Philadelphia, right? So people might have heard this term, and I'm sure many listeners are aware of it. So I'll try to make this as quick as possible for those that don't. The process was the idea that they were going to completely tear it down. They had a team that had kind of an average roster. They had a couple players that were very good. Drew Holiday, Andre Iguodala, I think we're still there at that time. Like very good players, but not good enough to help you win a championship. And they didn't really have a good way to get to a championship roster. Many ways what the Wizards have been. So there's your comparison. And what they did was instead of the traditional, like we just got to keep trying and hope we get lucky, it's like we're going to trade off these good pieces for parts. They don't fit our timeline to be able to win. And Holiday was young at the time. It's like 23, 24, but his ceiling was not high enough that he was going to be the best player on a championship team. And what they did was intentionally be pretty bad for a couple of years, and accumulate draft picks, and ultimately they wind up with Joel Embiid, who's the reigning MVP. But I think the part of that part of it is more well known and doesn't really apply to football because you don't have to bottom out in the NFL, and that's been proven time and time again. The part that I think is interesting and will carry over is the strategy side of it. Do they find someone who's willing to say the analytics tell us these things are best, so we're going to dive hard into that? The way they played basketball in Philadelphia was a ton of threes, a ton of free throws, very limited on long twos, which is the shots that the analytics say are the most valuable ones. And so whether it's Rivera and Bieniemy coming together and figuring out where the league is going and saying, hey, this is what the most advantageous way to play is, we're going to lead hard into it, or Harris asking ultimately what is his job. I'm going to ask tough questions. If your answers aren't good enough, I'm going to replace you. That's where he makes the difference. And I don't think Snyder knew enough to ask the right questions. That to me is where the rubber meets the road, is as he has conversations in house and watches the team play this year, does he feel like they are at least ahead of where the league is going from a strategic standpoint and a player development standpoint? And if not, then I think he ultimately makes changes and tries to find whoever that person is that's going to come up with the next thing.
Yeah, that'll be really relevant to our conversation for the last half of the show. But yeah, I think that's the interesting. That's super interesting because like it's so layered, and I'm not saying you need a tank, but obviously like next year there's going to be some good quarterbacks. Caleb Williams, probably
Sure.
first pick overall. Like, is that something you kind of make a move for? You know what I mean? And try to get a part of that if you're this new ownership group, and talk about a way to seal a rebrand or whatever you're going to do next year. Like, gosh, getting a franchise quarterback like that cures a lot of ails. And yeah, I'm just super curious because like how they handle all that stuff. So
Right. Well, it comes down defensively too, right? Like it's not just we always talk about offense, but like, are they ahead of where they need to be defensively? Like every part of the team is going to be under scrutiny, and we talked about this obviously a lot the last couple of weeks with all the play caller stuff, but like how influential were Vic Fangio and Brandon Staley and all these defensive coordinators who did funky stuff, or what previously was thought to be funky stuff, to help shut down the Shanahans, the McVays, and the McDaniels. Like, can they get one of those guys? Like that to me is the question. But then the other part of it too that he mentioned is like the sports science side. They are so behind on that because of lack of investment. They have smart people here that are good at that stuff.
Yeah.
But like, do you have the investment on the sports science side where this team has been so injured so often? Can you increase your winning by sheer availability being better? Like these are the kinds of things that are going to matter.
Yeah, I'm really curious. And, like to speaking to defensive point, like it's so funny, man. Like, Jack Del Rio is not considered like, I think perception wise, like an overly innovative guy. But when you look at what he's doing defensively, like he's kind of right there in terms of stuff that people are doing that's like pretty high level. So, like it's kind of goes against convention a little bit, but he's been pretty innovative and pretty ready to change over the last couple of years. But yeah, I agree, man. It's sports science stuff, the everything. I'm just so super curious to see, and it's not gonna be like overnight. It's gonna take probably 2 years to figure out what they're doing. But man, like I really am curious to see how you rebuild something like this from an ownership perspective, because I think we often see, like, we see a GM come in, we see a head coach come in, and those processes are a little bit more familiar. But here it's like, what do you even do? Because this is such a rare thing in the NFL. So I'm really curious to see what happens. And obviously, like you look at Carolina, and they're probably the most recent example of a team sale, and I don't want to say they've botched it, but it hasn't gone great, and so making good decisions with the head coach and the leadership and the coordinators, and like you mentioned, strength staff, analytics, all that stuff is going to be super, super interesting.
I'm hopeful that Josh Harris will avoid new owner syndrome because he's not a new owner. He's a new NFL owner, but like Tepper never been in
Right,
charge of a team
right,
before.
right, right, right.
And like Mark Cuban is considered a very good owner in the NBA. Like when Cuban got to Dallas, he did so many dumb things, like terrible. He signed Rafe LaFrentz to like a 7-year max contract, and like it killed them for years. There's just like all this stuff that they did that was silly. And a lot of new owners do that, right? Tepper comes in, he's like, I know better. All these stupid NFL owners. Been waiting for
Yeah,
my shot. I got it. I'm going to hire Matt Rule.
yeah,
Whoops. Like, so what do you do when you get the power? And I think this is where I was really impressed with Harris, where he just seems to be very level headed.
yeah,
And even though he kind of did a version of this in Philadelphia, like there was strategy behind it. It wasn't
yeah,
like I'm doing something new and different and I'm smarter than everyone else. It's just like, hey, we all agree this is the best strategy, right? Why is no one fully going for it? And
right.
he went for it. And so I don't think he's going to go hire some. Now, maybe I'm eating my words a year from now as we're on the verge of training camp with insert college coach here. But like, I don't think he's going to go hire some college coach to come in. Like, he understands that these are adults and that they need a certain type of coach. And, there's a professionalism that is necessary in the franchise. And I also think someone like Magic is super helpful there. Like Magic's main role, Magic said this, is going to be in the community, right? He's
Yeah,
already done a ton of business in DC. There's movie theaters he's opened. He's been in other types of, whether it's philanthropy or business dealings in the DC area, and so there's connections he has that are super helpful. But like if they go to hire a dumb coach and Magic's like, look, man, like this ain't it, then that guy's probably not getting hired. And so I think that that is also good in terms of some of the, let's call it the fail safes, some of the barriers that are in place with the diversity in this ownership group, in terms of having a strong number or a strong influence from a small but not overly limited number of people, if that makes
yeah.
sense.
And even in like the what is that? What's the name of the podcast? Jordan Rodriguez, the Signal? No,
The play callers.
the play callers. Like they talked about, the hiring process for like Sean McVay, and it was so different than what I expected. I thought it would be like this super kind of well organized, but it's like, oh, like, the owner really likes what this guy's got to say, so we had to sell him. And it was like Marshall Faulk, remember? And like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, just like, can you eliminate some of that stuff and kind of make
But
sure you
that
got the
stuff
right?
happens, and right,
I
if
know it
if
does.
the thing is though, like if it's Marshall Faulk and Marshall Faulk's judgment is excellent, then that works. And if it's Marshall Faulk is terrible at this, then it doesn't work. Like sometimes that's it.
Yeah,
It's not like, of course, it's always the process of it, no pun intended, but like it's also the who in the process.
yeah,
And I would trust, even for an NFL head coach, I would trust Magic Johnson's judgment on key parts of that, because Magic has done nothing but win his entire life.
yeah.
And so
That's a good point.
I think that some of the people they have in place, their BS detectors are high, their track records are strong, and those are good guardrails to have. Now you still have to get the football side right, and that's the hardest part, because who do you trust that has like a good football acumen? Who is the Marshall Faulk that becomes the confidant of Josh Harris, that is the really smart, innovative football brain that can help
Yeah,
lead you to the right place? Or are you hiring a search firm, or however you go about
yeah.
it?
I mean,
Um,
again, that'll
but
be
that
interesting
those
too, how they
are
decide to do that.
those are
Yeah.
tough questions that I think are down the road, obviously, because they are going to stick with who they have right now, and that we shouldn't get too far ahead of that either.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and that's another one of those interesting pieces in the process. Like, there's so many things that are going to happen, and like, I just can't wait to see, because again, it's so familiar. New GM, this is what we do, right? We accrue draft picks, we build through the draft, whatever. Head coach, like we bring in an innovative offensive philosophy. That seems to be the way to go. Ownership, I haven't seen a successful owner transition in a while, so I'm hoping that this group can get that done and give us a really solid data point. So really looking forward to it.
Yeah. One of the things that I think would be interesting is talking to some of the other teams in town. Now, I don't know how much the Wizards are going to want to talk to Josh Harris because he owns the Sixers. But like the Wizards are going through this a little bit with the
I
new
like this
GM and
idea.
president they
Very good.
have of like, yeah, it turns out you guys are super behind. And like that's Ted had a willingness to spend. I don't think the people in charge were up enough to know what to spend on.
Right.
And so now Will Dawkins and Michael Winger come in to people that helped build the Oklahoma City Thunder into the premier organization when it comes to infrastructure in the entire NBA. The Clippers are also right there, who Winger helped build after he left Oklahoma City. That's part of the reason he got hired there. So now they come to DC and they're like, yeah, this practice facility that you were super proud of is actually not that cool. And so there's things like that are happening behind the scenes. And I think picking the brain of other teams in town could be smart. The Washington Spirit, same thing. They go through an ownership change and they have done more hiring by percentage than I think probably it has to be the highest in professional sports. Like the way they've turned over their franchise and brought in someone like Don Scott, who is the premier like strength and conditioning coach in the women's soccer world. Like they hired her and let her hire a staff. So like what does the NFL version of that look like? Because there just aren't a lot of roadmaps with NFL teams, because most NFL teams have been spending bukus of money and are on the cutting edge already, while this team has been left behind. So, between getting people from other organizations that have done it well, picking the brains of people in other sports in and out of town, how do you ultimately build the optimized plan moving forward? That's what this organization has to figure out. They got to figure out who the right people are to run it. But it definitely seems like Josh Harris understands that. And those are the types of things he's thinking about over the next year, on top of some of the other, the name and the branding and the stadium. They've obviously got to figure out all of that kind of stuff.
Totally agree.
All right, flipping gears here on Take Command. Let's talk X's and O's. Let's talk football and how this team ultimately progresses on the field. And Logan, we perhaps more than anyone else have talked about how the scheme change this year, one, was necessary. We spent a lot of time breaking down some of the shortfalls last season, but then the ways that we think Eric Bieniemy can help, Sam Howell can help this offensive line. I know you were listening to another podcast recently that talked about some of these things, that gave you some ideas and some of the key points that we can apply to the Commander. So first, let's shout out whoever you're listening to.
Yeah,
so that way
the Ringer, they did
the Ringer NFL show.
Yeah,
okay.
And it's well done. And so like I will say one of the things about those guys is they're not like, they are football guys, but they don't coach. They're like more analytics based guys. Mm-hmm. And so their observations, I think, are very unique because like their observations are super like formational based, super kind of personnel based. And so like, their conclusion was like teams are going to be in 11 more, which is, through wide receivers, one tight end, one back. Great. I agree with that. Teams are going to be in the gun more. Great. Agree with that. And one of the reasons they were kind of saying it's because you're getting this man match coverage and it's really hard for the quarterback to turn his back to the defense. Also agree with that. You're going to see a little bit less RPO, which I agree with, because RPO, I think, kind of is not as good as your quick game. It's not as good as a true run game, and teams are getting better at playing it. I agree with it. I think that their conclusions on like the benefits of certain things kind of overlook a really critical element. And I think like when you talk about offensive innovation, like there is innovation when it comes to route concepts and formations, 100%, right? Because, you're breaking rules. I think a great example is in the Detroit game last year versus the Commanders, where, they motion to a change of strength and they motion to a bunch. And then William Jackson III and Benjamin St. Juste aren't on the same page. And Amon-Ra St. Brown is over the middle on a dig. Like that, you're getting beat with the pen there. And there will always be innovation there. I think the thing that if there's one element of offensive innovation that I think is so important for fans to understand, like, we're talking about Harris and looking forward to the future. We're talking about this year with Eric Bieniemy, is pass protection, right? Obviously, like being in the gun is important, right? it allows the quarterback to keep his eyes on the defense in a way that you can't do necessarily from under center. Like that's the value of that. However, like you got to make sure you protect it, right? Because blitz packages, rushes, defensive personnel they're just getting better in that category. So I don't care how good your quarterback is. Like I don't care if they're exceptional. If you can't protect up front, like you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So to me, that is the thing that's interesting because they said teams are kind of moving away from true play action pass stuff. And I don't know if I totally agree with it. I think the role of play action pass is slightly changing. Does that make sense, Greg? It's not what it was with Kyle, where it's like we're run, play action, very limited drop back stuff. It is a feature of the offense from this kind of gun-centric approach, you know? And so I think the thing that I came away with was like, you know, they kept saying in the podcast, they need to, you know, find ways to get play action concepts into gun. And teams have done that. It's fine. But the thing that allows them to do that is they've changed protections. And we've talked with Eric Bieniemy. I've watched a lot of Kansas City film with Andy Reid. Like one of the things they do an excellent job of with that is they do a great job with like chip help by the backs, the tight ends, and working slides. And so chip help is basically like, I'm sure people kind of know what that is, but it's basically like, you know, let's say I've got 5 down linemen. I've got 2 backs in the backfield, like in a split back. With those backs, can protect the edges of that pocket by rushing them right at the outside rusher and forcing them to the tackle. And it just gives the tackle a little bit of an advantage so that they can win the down. And that's ultimately what you want to do, right? And so what I will say is Eric Bieniemy, Andy Reid, the guy in Detroit, has done a great job of getting to these deeper concepts by utilizing chip help and by utilizing slide protections and other things like that. So to me, the innovation, there's been a formational shift, right? And a prioritizing of this gun philosophy because the quarterback's got to see what's going on. But to me, the real innovation and the real kind of adjustment has come in the protection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, there's a ton there that I think is interesting. Let's work our way backwards, and hopefully I remember the other things I want to ask. But the chip help part of it, I think is pretty interesting because I feel like fans all the time, like your fan who cares about protection, the one who does more than yell, they got sacked again. The one who's like, got sacked again. Why don't they do X? The first thing they go to is like, why don't you chip? But there's also a downside to that.
Correct.
Which is you are delaying your back getting out of the backfield and potentially throwing the timing of whatever you're doing off. You can't, like, if you get a little chip, then maybe the route's on time. You get a big chip, the back could fall over. Sure, congrats. You have now gotten your successful contact on your chip, but 20% of your eligible receivers are no longer a factor in the down. And that's something that I remember talking about with Sean when he was here, because, keep a back, especially you keep a back in to protect. Right. You only get 5 eligibles. And so there's a different set of challenges that are presented here. And there are some tackles that don't really like chip help. So this is knowing your personnel as well, because it's like, hey, just leave me alone and let me do my thing versus, okay, I know the chip is coming. I can set a little farther inside. So from a concept, I was going to say from a concept standpoint, I think these are some of the factors that don't necessarily present themselves on the surface that OCs have to think about, but the more you use them, you see the innovation, and ultimately they're mastered better. And I think that's hopefully what you're starting to see in the league.
Yeah, and so I think that's the thing is like, it is limiting, right? But if you think about like play action pass concepts, it's like a 2-man, 3-man route combination that needs to kind of overload coverages in a specific way. So like one that I saw, which I really, really liked, that Detroit ran, was basically what they call like a Miami concept. So basically like the receiver to the right runs like a 15-yard sit. And in quarters, that safety to that side is going to attach to that, right? And you know that because it's in like kind of that weird depth where it's not 10, it's not 20. He's got to buy it, right? And so what they did is to the other side, they run like a deep post. And it's not like a traditional post. It's like an angle, like running across the field. And so he's running that deep post on a quarter safety, right? And so that other side of the field is completely open. The problem is that this is a very long developing concept. So like, how do you get to it, right? So what Detroit did is they work a slide protection. So they slide the offensive line right, which helps the offensive line. So that right tackle gets slide help. You have the tight end off the ball, sift back across the formation, and chip the defensive end with running back help. And so you are kind of in this weird like max pro, but because the back's there to help the tight end, the back can get out to the flat and have flat control for this other route concept over. It's like basically a curl, right? So like if I was going through the routes, it's like deep sit, post, curl, chip to the flat, right? So you are gaining a 2-level throw to the left there if you need it, but it is happening later in the down. You're really trying to hit the home run here to this deep post. And that protection works great because you're helping the right tackle, you're helping the left tackle, and you're helping the tight end. And so you've allowed Jared Goff enough vision to the field to make this throw. And it's not off a play action, it's on 3rd and 10, and you've added it. What Mike McDaniel says is you've added a hitch, right? So you've gotten back there. Mm-hmm. I've done my 5-step drop, or it's 3-step from the gun, and I can hitch one more time and launch this football down the field just because of this protection design, right? So just chipping is not the answer. I need a well-reasoned concept that is going to get open on the second hitch. If I don't do that, like let's say, for example, like Scott Turner did this a ton last year, and I know he's not here anymore. This is not like a rain on Scott Turner parade here, but like when you run 3 verticals, right? Because we just talked about 3 eligible receivers, they came up with this concept called Miami, I'm going to call it, right? They run 3 verticals into the teeth of the defense. There is no conflict for the defense. Like if you're in cover 3 and you're running verticals, those corners are just going to get really deep with those verticals. The post safety is going to stay right there, and there's no conflict. So I could chip all day. I could chip a million times. I could, like the quarterback could chip. I don't know, right? Like there's no way that they're going to get open versus that coverage. You need like a well-reasoned pass concept that manipulates the coverage you're expecting and gives the quarterback an opportunity to throw the football.
Right. Well, and it also accounts for the timing differences and things that I talked about, right? If that
Yes.
check or if that chip player is the last player in the progression,
right?
Even they could fall down while chipping and still get up and probably still get open. Occasionally that doesn't happen. Your quarterback has to eat it, but it is what it is. But you've also, like you said, you've created some real issues for the defense that hopefully it's a smarter route concept. So that was one of the things that I think, where the innovation helps, right? You think of some of the problems with some of the things that we're talking about in the past, the innovation solves the problem. So the next problem that I would raise that has been an issue in the past with this concept being a large term here that we're talking about is play action out of the gun typically hasn't been very effective.
No.
Play action when the quarterback does not turn their back and like really, show the ball typically doesn't actually get the bite that you're after. The token fakes don't have the same effect on the defense. Now, the problem with when, hey, we want to run play action, our quarterback needs to turn his back to the defense is your quarterback's turning his back to the defense. When he turns around, he's got to create a picture versus, I'm riding this fake and getting to scan while I ride the fake. How have teams gotten around that to make it worthwhile to have the play action in the first place?
Yeah. So I think that, it's a really, really good question. So let's just start with like what we were just talking about with like chip help, right? So when I'm running these like deep play action concepts with chip help, right? I'm not getting the same draw from the linebackers or on the linebackers. I'm not putting them in conflict in the same way. So as a quarterback, I have to understand, and this is obviously coaching, right? They're going to get some depth. And then all of a sudden those chip players, which are kind of, forgotten thoughts in most people's offenses, become your primary read. So you'll see like with Kansas City, for example, like if Mahomes is a magician, right? That he can fit balls wherever they need to go. But let's say he can't, he'll check the ball down to like Isaiah Pacheco for like a 15-yard gain and a first down because everybody's gotten under these like deeper, longer developing concepts. So that's one thing. Also, like you look around, you see like, oh, like you've got these token fakes now, right? But how you run the fake is also important. So like, for example, when I was prepping for this, I was watching Cincinnati. And they brought the tight end in motion to kind of a fullback spot, had him ISO on the linebacker. That token fake all of a sudden has some more teeth to it, just by giving it a little bit more action. So the linebacker comes up and fits the tight end. The back doesn't even touch the football. The fake is terrible. But I remember when I was with Kyle, he used to say something like, it's not the action necessarily. It's what they're seeing from the combinations up front. That's the thing that kind of like is the Pavlov's dogs thing. It like just triggers the linebacker, right? So if that's good, and on this fake, like the fake is terrible, the ball fake's terrible, but the action's really strong. Then you get T. Higgins on a dig where that linebacker is supposed to be, and it's an easy completion for Joe Burrow, right? So like they are finding ways to increase and improve the actions, those kind of token fake actions from the backfield. Like I think another one is Mahomes and Kansas City. They'll run like a jet sweep action, and they'll just kind of the quarterback's eyes are directly on the field and just have him go like run the ball with the jet sweep, and the linebackers will move. And it's like they found ways to get harder actions for the linebackers off of some different kind of looks with the play action. And I do think like when you look at Detroit, for example, or San Francisco, like we've talked about, they still run a ton of under center play action because they run the ball a ton. But it's just about when they get to that. It's like this is our haymaker. We got to hit it, right? We got to ensure that we hit it. And I think that's where play action, the role is kind of shifted. You're getting into, because like third down's a down you got to win. You got to be in the gun. You got to find a way to protect it. That's kind of what we're talking about. But first and second down, that play action is still a very potent weapon, I think. Does that answer your question, Greg?
Yeah. So I guess this leads to my other big bugaboo with play action, which is when teams run play action fakes off of runs they don't actually run. Because to me, that would be like the way that you get around, okay, it's a token fake, but like if it's a run you actually run and it looks the same, and no matter how good the ball fake is, if my key as a linebacker is to see this, running back taking a certain track or a tight end pulling a certain way, the guard, obviously the offensive line on a play action is going to look like they're run blocking for a second before they get into their pass sets, at least theoretically. That's how that works. If I'm reading that key and it looks like something that's run, the ball fake doesn't matter. The ball fake is the least important part of that. Right. So is that a part of what's also happening here is you're seeing better marry of run and pass games, and that for some reason is an innovation that a lot of offensive coordinators used to not care about. That it's like, yeah, we don't run outside zone, but the play actions off it are great, so we're going to fake it all the time. And any moderately intelligent defender could figure out that it was going to be play action.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And like, when I was with Kyle, like we had a run, it was called, what was it? It was 14, 15 Wanda Y man from the gun. So it would have been 30, 34, 35, right? And we did not run that run at all. We never ran that run. But we ran the play action pass a ton. And we coached the crap out of the play action. And we were so good at running the fake that the linebackers would fit it every single time. So, you know what I mean? I think there is maybe a school of thought that, like, okay, for example, you mentioned the outside zone thing. I think that's a really potent point. Like you need to run some version of that run. Like we ran tight zone. So, you know what I'm saying? Like we did run a version of that. So it wasn't like, oh, we've never run tight zone before in our whole lives. Let's throw it in right now. We've run tight zone. It just didn't run that exact run. So I do think you have to have something in the bag that resembles what you're play action faking. I just don't think you need to so for example, like if we want to run outside zone, we don't need to run the exact mirror. So let's say, for example, we're running like pass 18, F sift. Like we don't need to run that run, but we can run that as a play pass, but the outside zone action is still going to work. Does that make sense what I'm saying? It's like you don't need to run
it's got to be similar enough.
Yeah, don't need to run the exact run, but you need to have something that says, oh, I got to go. And I think when you look at Kansas City, for example, one of the things that I find fascinating about that offense and the way they've solved the problem is they don't do a ton of like hard play action fakes. Oftentimes the tackles are like pass setting almost, but the backfield action is so aggressive, like with the jet sweep and then the ball fake to the back, that the D line knows it's pass, so they start pass rushing, but the linebackers are trying to fit those different keys, and you get them to kind of step up in the line of scrimmage. So I think there are different ways to get there, obviously. And I think, but to your point and to this innovation point, it's how do you get there given your personnel, And so like in Kansas City, their O-line was pretty good. Their tackles were okay. They emphasized chip help for the tackles. This violent jet sweep kind of token fake action worked really well for them, partially because they have Patrick Mahomes. But I think that is really interesting. And then in this podcast, again, kind of just totally off the tangent, Kansas City ran more 13 personnel runs than any team in the NFL last year. So there's this kind of confluence of like, can I get in a big personnel to match the nickel? Can I use personnel to influence? But I do think that kind of at the core of everything, it's if I want to pass the football, how do I insulate the pass? Is it play action? Is it quick game? Is it screen? Is it token fake? Is it jet sweep action? And I need to practice it enough that I'm really good at it, and from a protection standpoint.
Right. And that was, the jet sweep one is kind of what made me think of all this too, because there were definitely times last year where they'd go games without running it and you'd see teams just wouldn't react. The fake is haphazard, where you watch Kansas City and it's like, we're going to run a jet sweep 2-3 times a game. So you better be ready for it all time. And Mahomes might not even have to actually fake the jet sweep. Just the guy running by is enough to move the linebackers. And that's kind of to your point of like, when you realize what it is, to me, this is the innovation, and see if I've distilled this properly, right? But to me, the actual innovation is realizing what it is that the defense is reacting to and manipulating that. It's not, hey, we got to do this fake handoff thing. Because the handoff is not actually what anybody's looking at. It's realizing that it's where the guard goes, where the jet sweep guy goes, or whatever, and manipulating the actual thing that is being reacted to, which goes to an understanding of defense that for, I think, a lot of NFL history, offensive coaches kind of didn't care about. They just were like, we're going to dictate and they'll react. And now, as we saw in play callers and what we've seen just by our observations, you have a group of offensive coaches that understands defenses better, and that's also coincided with defenses becoming more complex, and there being a need to do that, and then trying to manipulate that, which leads to this like kind of circular nature of innovation. One thing cyclical is more what I'm saying, of one thing reacts to the next, reacts to the next, reacts to the next.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree. That's 100% right, and I think that's what's characterizing innovation, and I think your personnel characterize it, right? Because Kyle, with his like fullbacks and tight ends, is innovating differently than, the Cincinnati Bengals and Joe Burrow. But I also think, like, when you're talking about the pass game specifically, it's the innovation. Route concepts are super. There's only a certain number of route concepts you can do. The thing that makes it go is the protection for the quarterback, and that is where you have to be really, really sharp. And I think that's where EB, at least through OTAs and minicamp, has shown an understanding of chip help, alignment, like just putting guys in tight splits, quick game, screens, a little bit of RPO stuff, right? Like all that stuff adds up so that when I do take my shot, the O-line's in a good spot. So like that's something that I think is, and that's not even an indictment of personnel. That's across the league. Like Philly has the best O-line in football. They can do whatever they want, right? They have Lane Johnson, they have Jordan Mailata, they have an excellent group, right? They're dominant. But when you look at even like Cincinnati, when you look at the 49ers, when you look at Kansas City even, like you have to find a way to insulate that group so you can push the ball down the field. And that to me is what I think they kind of missed, is a lot of teams, yes, they're getting in the gun more. But the thing that is allowing that is the sequencing of plays and protecting and insulating the offensive line. So that's kind of what I would say, just adding my 2 cents to that.
No, it's really good.
Yeah.
Glad we talked about that, because now we get to track it all season long. Right. Starting with Wednesday's practice. There is a practice on Wednesday. It's not open to the public. First open practice that you all can go to as fans is Thursday. But depending on our recording schedule, Logan and I might be able to react to the first practice. But we'll really treat the pod later this week as a training camp preview, kind of refresher. Every single thing that you need to know going into training camp, all the position battles, all the key storylines. There will be the ultimate training camp primer that is a must listen to for every Commanders fan. So that is coming up later this week. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, and you're watching it especially on YouTube, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening somewhere else. If you're not already subscribed, it's subscription season, Logan. Now is the time that you need to listen every week. Football is back, baby, and we'll be back later this week here on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.